Good evening, everybody. My name is Maylin, and I'm a CAP member with KQED Live. KQED is Northern California's PBS NPR member station. KQED Live is our events program that produces screenings, talks, performances, and food tastings based on KQED's mission to inform, inspire, and involve. If we bring value to your everyday life, I encourage you to consider becoming a KQED member. Becoming a member at KQED means supporting local journalism. The slide behind me shows the full range of benefits, and I want to shout out the early ticket access and 15% discount to select events. Scan the QR code to become a member or visit kqed.org/donate. We want to thank the seasoned sponsors that make KQED Live possible: the San Francisco Symphony, Comcast Business, and Genentech. We are so grateful for their commitment to supporting our mission of civic and cultural engagement in the Bay Area. Now, I'd like to introduce our host and producer of tonight's program. Cecilia Lei is an award-winning producer and reporter in the Bay Area. Most recently, she was the executive producer and host of Fifth and Mission, the San Francisco Chronicle's flagship daily news podcast. She has reported on issues of race, immigration, criminal justice, and the Bay Area Asian American community. Soon, you can also catch her on KQED's radio program, Forum, as an on-call host. Please give a warm welcome to our host, Cecilia Lei.
Hi, everyone. How is everyone doing? Good. It is so nice to be here with all of you. And I ask how you're doing because I also know there's just a lot happening in the world right now and here at home. And in times like these, it's really easy to feel disillusioned. So I just want to kick off by saying thank you. Thank you for being here to be a part of this conversation, whether you're here in this room with me or watching from home. Because I do think that making a choice to be in community in a time like this is also making an active choice to not be disheartened. And community is the focus of tonight's program. And in a lot of ways, producing this event is a culmination of a lot of things I've been thinking about, not only in my work as a journalist, but also as an Asian American and a Bay Area native. Tonight is a reflection on the complexities, the tensions, and opportunities in Asian American advocacy and organizing. There are a lot of things that I'm really proud to claim as someone born and raised in the Bay, and one of them is that the Bay Area is the birthplace of the Asian American identity. The term Asian American was first coined in 1968 by two UC Berkeley graduate student activists, Yuji Ichioka and Emma G, when they created the Asian American Political Alliance. They had this belief that uniting a pan-ethnic group would give Asian Americans more political sway. So fast forward 56 years later, in 2024, we are hearing a lot about just how much political sway Asian Americans have. With the election around the corner, that is the buzz, especially here in San Francisco, as political candidates fight for our votes, as news stories try to make sense of what's been taking shape over the past 4 years or so. And there's been this unprecedented visibility on Asian Americans. But with that visibility comes a lot of questions. Questions like whose voices are being heard, which narratives are being amplified, and which ones are being left out. Tonight is an opportunity to reflect on the historical and cultural dynamics that have shaped the Asian American identity and our community's current political moment, from the pivotal Third World Liberation Front movement in the late 60s to the recent Stop AAPI Hate movement. Later this evening, I'll be moderating two panels that will help us look critically at this present moment and also envision where do we go from here. But first, we're going to give some important historical context. I mentioned that year, 1968, because that's where we're going to go. We're going to learn about the legacy of one important Bay Area Filipino American civil rights activist, and it's really fitting because this month is Filipino American History Month. And the storytelling piece that you're about to watch is an adaptation of an episode of Inheriting. Are there any Inheriting podcast listeners in here? Great, I see some hands. If you haven't checked it out, you must. Inheriting is a 10-part podcast series that launched earlier this year. It's about AAPI history told through family stories. It's produced by LAS Studios and distributed by the NPR network. So the piece you're about to see is produced by me and the two storytellers you're about to meet. Emily Kwong is an audio journalist working at the crossroads of sociopolitical history, family memory, and mental health. She's the host of Inheriting and also the co-host and founding reporter of Shortwave, a science podcast from NPR. Everyone, please welcome Emily. We need the mic. There it is. And next we have Nicole Salaver, who is a San Francisco-based writer, producer, and filmmaker. She's a program manager at Balay Kreative, a pop-up Filipino-American arts hub in Soma, Filipinas. Nicole's also the producer and host of the Cultural Cultivators podcast. Everyone, please welcome Nicole. Thank you.
So, I was one of those kids who went to camp every summer, but it wasn't one of those fancy camps with cabins and canoes. No, I was being raised by a single mom who's actually here tonight. Ow! And my camp, yeah, give her a round of applause. So my camp was Uncle Pat's house in Southern California. And Uncle Pat is the oldest sibling of my mom's family. He is the leader and the mobilizer. When my parents divorced, my mom, again, was single, and so she needed her brother's help. So my Uncle Pat became a second father to me. He and my Aunt Marcy took in all the neighborhood kids, bought us all bikes, and all summer we would just bike around the neighborhood and do all these random projects Uncle Pat assigned us. He was also a gifted jazz musician and a total troublemaker.
When Nicole and I first started chatting about her Uncle Pat, she described him as this warm, welcoming, but get your ass in here type. If one of the kids got in trouble, he would give them a choice. You're either going to get spanked or I'm going to lecture you.
Seriously. His lectures would be 2 to 3 hours long, and we would have to sit and listen. Sometimes it would get so long, we would just ask for the spanking to get it over with. And Uncle Pat's superpower was talking.
And his life was this sweeping epic that stretched from the grape fields of Delano to the anti-war protests that shook up the nation. Pat was in the room when Larry Itliong and Cesar Chavez merged their unions, when Mexican farm workers joined Filipino farm workers on the picket line.
In fact, there's this joke in my family that Uncle Pat is the Filipino Forrest Gump. Well, because he saw and experienced all of Phil-Am history. So when I was in my 30s, I decided it was finally time to record his stories. And every time I'd visit him in LA, I would just bust out my video camera.
Light bothering you?
No, it's okay.
Okay. Yeah, it looks good. You look good, Uncle Pat.
We'd be sitting in his garage, most of the time smoking weed, and I just press record.
We're going to be around too long.
Why do you say that? We're all Uncle Pat. Don't be selfish.
Yeah, right.
We're all gonna be gone.
Yes.
I recorded about 15 hours of footage, and my Uncle Pat was just there flexing his superpower, storytelling.
I'm starting to jump out of my skin. I'm looking at the sky, and all of a sudden, I'm fearing for my life for some reason.
Uncle Pat told so many stories. But the story we want to tell you today is one you probably don't know, about Patrick J. Salaver, the civil rights hero. He transformed higher education in the 1960s, organizing right here in San Francisco.
If you ask any Mexican American, who is Cesar Chavez?
If you ask any African American person, who is Malcolm X, who is MLK?
But if you ask any Filipino, but everyone knows who those people are. Any American knows who they are.
But if you ask a Filipino American or Asian American, who is Patrick Salaver?
They probably have no clue. But to me, he was just as important. He sacrificed his own freedom for the sake of equality.
So in 1967, Pat was a student at San Francisco State University, then called San Francisco State College.
My alma mater.
And that summer, he got wrapped in the political moment.
What is it that America has failed to hear? It has failed to hear that the plight of the Negro poor has worsened over the last few years.
The civil rights movement was dovetailing with the anti-Vietnam War movement. And the Black Panther Party had just been established across the bay in Oakland.
And here, whether you know it or not, is where you start dealing with the Black Revolution.
And at San Francisco State, the Black Student Union was at war with the administration, fighting for more Black students to be admitted to the school. Why? Because a disproportionate number of Black and brown young men were being drafted into the Vietnam War, and the BSU knew that college enrollment could save your life. The BSU also wanted the school to hire more Black professors and to establish a Black Studies department. Now Pat, Nicole's uncle, he wanted to join the BSU to support their cause. As a first-gen student from a working-class family, he understood their demands. But instead, the BSU leaders encouraged him to start his own organization for Filipino Americans. And what Pat created was PACE, which stood for the Philippine American Collegiate Endeavor. And he began to go around campus recruiting members.
But all these Filipino students, they were super confused by what he was trying to do because there had never really been a political organization for Filipinos before at any college, anywhere in the nation. And so here was my Uncle Pat trying to start one on the grassy lawns of SF State, just a few miles from where we are today.
It was difficult because, I would have to organize and canvass people to understand what the organization was all about. And that wasn't so easy because I had to.
But my Uncle Pat was relentless. He would just walk up to students and ask if they were Filipino. Then tell them, not invite them, tell them, great, you're a member of PACE now. You're coming to the first meeting.
Granted, many of them said, no, I'm not interested. Some of them, when they saw me coming, they would run the other way.
And PACE still exists at SF State today as a Philippine X American Collegiate Endeavor, and some of their members are actually here in the audience tonight. Let's give them applause. And though PACE recognizes a few co-founders, none of them argue that my Uncle Pat was actually the lead founder, the mobilizer. And he led PACE students to fight for Filipinos all over the Bay Area.
Through Pat's leadership, PACE participated in the anti-eviction protests at the International Hotel.
Fight hard with us so that we can maintain the hotel from being demolished.
A 3-story building in Manilatown that was home to elderly and low-income Filipinos, many of whom were from the Manong generation, who immigrated in the 20s and 30s.
People in support of the International Hotel tenants.
Uncle Pat and Pace also helped Filipino kids in Bernal Heights District apply for scholarships and fill out college applications. Just like BSU, Pace knew that getting their peers into college would possibly save their lives from the draft. And Pat wanted Pace to be in solidarity with all the other student groups at State, pushing for school to admit more BIPOC students and teach a curriculum that served all people, not just a white, Eurocentric view of history and the world.
Pat's leadership of Filipino students was like a stone in a pond, sending out waves and preparing the Bay Area for the battle to come. 1968 was the breaking point. That was the year Martin Luther King Jr. and Bobby Kennedy were assassinated, and the Vietnam War showed no signs of slowing down. And SF State wasn't changing fast enough. So the Black Student Union invited all the other student groups to form a coalition. Their roster included the Latin American Students Organization, El Renacimiento, the Intercollegiate Chinese for Social Action, and of course, PACE. Together, these students called themselves the Third World Liberation Front.
Developed by the Third World faculty, by Third World students, and Third World community people. We have had a strike.
The idea behind the name Third World was to call attention to the Third World struggles happening in colonial and post-colonial countries. And because of Pat, Filipino students like Nestor Aquino were organized and ready to fight.
Not very many of you know the difference. For your information, Philippine refers to the country and Filipino refers to the people. This is exactly what we want. In this campus is a study of Filipino culture and history.
Instructors on campus got on board too. Some of them taught a third world curriculum, which connected oppression abroad to oppression in the United States. And one of those instructors was a Black grad student named George Murray, who was also the Black Panthers Minister of Education.
We were attacked because we were Black people striving to politically educate the masses of the people here in America to create a new system of government
that September at a press conference, George Murray shared the Black Panthers' position on the war.
Our statement was that the war in Vietnam is racist. It is a war that crackers like Johnson are using Black soldiers and poor white soldiers and Mexican soldiers as dupes and fools to fight against people of color in Vietnam.
Murray kept speaking out with even stronger language, and the college suspended him.
We're going into the buildings as a mass, and we're going to ask people to come out of classes.
In response, hundreds of students began to gather, demanding Murray be reinstated and the curriculum be changed. The strike began on November 6th, 1968.
This school's on strike until he meets with us, until he meets those demands.
And Pat and Pace were there, refusing to go back to class. And joining the rest of the Third World Liberation Front in what would become the longest student strike in US history.
Over the next few days, weeks, and months, the protest grew. Police, or the tactical squad, were in full riot gear, some on horseback, some spraying mace, swinging batons at students and instructors. In response, even more students and instructors quit class and joined the strike, unafraid to face the police.
Get back, pig! Get back, pig! Get back, pig!
And the strike leaders agreed the next time the police tried to arrest a protester, they would all intervene. This is a story my uncle told me in his own words.
The tactical squad comes and arrests somebody, okay, and then takes them out. How come nobody's doing anything? How come no one's trying to stop this arrest,
And so my uncle, he threw something towards the police line, but it hit a cop on his helmet.
And you could hear that whack through the entire campus. So I turned around to run, and everybody was gone. There was nobody to hide behind.
And my uncle was the only one there. Then all of these cops were descending on him with their batons out.
These cops, were gonna have a beating party.
Then all of a sudden, a white nursing student jumped on his body in solidarity and protection.
And that stopped the tactical squad from hitting me.
Pat and students like him put their very physical safety on the line and their education on hold to fight for a better future for all of us.
Lasting 5 months, the Third World Liberation Front is still the longest strike in US history. And it only ended when the BSU and the Third World Liberation Front leaders reached a deal with the administration, when the school agreed to admit more non-white college applicants in the fall and established the nation's first ever College of Ethnic Studies.
Number one, that funds be allocated to the implementation of the Third World Policy.
The students The student strike was so momentous, it inspired protests at other schools like UC Berkeley and Columbia University. This movement changed higher education forever, and it paved the way for the kind of student protesting and coalition building we see today. Because of Pat and student leaders like him, there are now hundreds of ethnic studies programs across the United States. Curricula that tell a truer story of the history of this country and how communities of color have always been agents of change.
Unfortunately, my Uncle Pat was punished for being so outspoken, and after the strikes ended, he resisted the draft, which, many people did, and only 0.5% were ever convicted. But my uncle was in that 0.5%, and because of his political activism, he was targeted by the FBI's counterintelligence program, and he was put in federal prison for 2 years. In prison, he wrote a letter, which was published by Rolling Stone magazine. Emily actually recorded my other uncle, Tim Salaver, reading it for this story.
My crime was not a violent act. It had no victims, other than myself, perhaps. My crime was confronting a brutal system that denied me and others around the world the right of self-determination. This is the 10th year of our participation in the war in Southeast Asia, and it has been clear for some time to many that it was wrong. This being an election year, many politicians will at least say it was wrong, yet I suspect that many of us will still be in jail this Christmas. Set us free.
My Uncle Pat was eventually set free, but he wasn't the same after prison. While many of the fellow organizers had illustrious career paths, like judges or tenured professors, my uncle never graduated from college. And for as long as I knew him, he buried that part of his past, a shame. Until, in 1999, I went to SF State. And I realized what had happened and how much he sacrificed because I took a Filipino-American history class taught by Professor Dan Gonzalez. That's when I fully grasped everything. And that's why I started interviewing him, piecing together the fragments, why I told Emily the story on Inheriting podcast, and why I feel it's important to share with all of you today. In 2003, I was preparing to graduate SF State, and I fought to get my Uncle Pat an honorary degree. So he stood in front of 300 Filipino Americans who were all about to graduate because of him. because of his sacrifice. I don't think he's ever seen anything like that. And it's my dream to make his life and his sacrifice into a movie. October is actually Filipino American History Month. Yes. And this year's theme is struggle, resistance, solidarity, and resiliency. And now more than ever, I want everyone, not just Filipino Americans, not just Asian Americans, but all Americans to know my uncle's name, Patrick Salaver.
Asian Americans are the fastest growing racial or ethnic group in the United States and the fastest growing group of eligible voters. That means we are amassing more and more political power, and my question to you all is, what are we going to do with it? That's why we wanted to make the Inheriting podcast a space where people could learn about the histories of communities different than their own, to find inspiration when the time comes to fight together. Stop AAPI Hate was co-founded when community leaders from Chinese for Affirmative Action, the AAPI Equity Alliance, and the Asian American Studies Department at San Francisco State came together to document the rise of anti-Asian racism in the early stages of the global pandemic. It was exactly the kind of coalition building that Pat championed. We stand on his shoulders and the shoulders of centuries of Asian Americans who took the harder path for the greater good. There are countless heroes unknown to history. We may not know their names, but we are living in their future. So the question is, what future are we building now?
Before my uncle passed away in 2019, one of the most significant pieces of advice he left with me was, we all have the opportunity to be a channel for change. And if each of us tries to make the world a better place around us, if each person did that, then it's true. One person can change the world. Patrick Salaver's willingness to put himself on the front lines, to risk everything, shows me that as Asian Americans, we can't just stand by silently. We have to step up. We have to build bridges, and we have to fight for a future where all our communities are thriving together. Because collective action brings collective liberation. Thank you.
Everyone, let's give it up for Emily and Nicole one more time. So if you didn't know about Patrick Salaver, now you know. Please check out the Inheriting podcast if you haven't already for even more incredible AAPI family stories that help illuminate our community history. Before we move on, I also want to quickly shout out some special folks in the room. We also have some other former Third World Liberation Front activists here with us tonight. Is Harvey Dong and Keith and Priscilla Kojimoto here? If you are, raise your hand, or are they not? There they are. Everyone, please give it up to them as well. So, in this next panel, we're going to fast forward to our current context where we see echoes of the activism that we just learned about in the late 60s in the Stop AAPI Hate movement. It is really undeniable that Stop AAPI Hate has been very impactful. It's shaped conversations around public safety, influenced campaign strategies of political candidates in cities like San Francisco, where the Asian American vote has become a decisive factor in the local political landscape. Joining me now are our next speakers. Dr. Russell Jeung is a professor of Asian American Studies at San Francisco State and an author of books and articles on race and religion. In March 2020, Dr. Jeung co-founded Stop AAPI Hate, a coalition that was awarded the 2021 Webby Award for Social Movement of the Year. And in 2021, he was named as one of the Time 100 most influential persons. Everyone, please welcome Russell. Joining Dr. Jeung is Greg Wong. Greg is an award-winning reporter for the San Francisco Examiner. He covers a wide range of stories in San Francisco. He primarily writes about Asian American issues, politics, transit, technology, race, and breaking news. Everyone, please welcome Greg. So thank you both for being here. We were saying backstage, we have to follow that amazing performance.
Thanks, Cecilia.
But this is going to be a great conversation, and one that I've been wanting to have for a really long time. Russell, I'd love to start with you. A lot of people have come to know you in recent years after you co-founded Stop AAPI Hate. But you've been a community leader for a long time, teaching Asian American Studies at SF State for over 2 decades now. And you and other academics have highlighted that the late 1960s, when the Third World Liberation Front strikes happened, was this time when Asian American students like Patrick Salaver developed this critical consciousness of their status as unequal racial minorities. And there were other social movements happening at that time, the Black Power movement, free speech movement, women's liberation. Tell us, what was it about the Third World Liberation Front movement specifically that was very fundamental in forming the political identity of Asian Americans?
Well, thanks, Cecilia, and thanks, KQED, for inviting us. The 60s was a really seminal moment. I grew up then. I grew up in the 1900s, a century ago.
So did I. I did too.
And I don't think people recognized how militant it was. And in some ways really similar to this current period, but there was a war going on like we have now in Israel and Palestine and the Ukraine. And I think what was fundamental about the Third World Liberation Front that actually resonated with the Asian American students was that they too recognized the twin evils of racism and imperialism. At that time, Asian Americans came from ghettos like Manila Town, like where the I Hotel was, like Chinatowns. They understood that the Vietnam War was an unjust war of colonization. And so their own lived experience really connected with the Third World. They actually had a real sense of solidarity with Third World peoples. And that's what I want our students today to really feel like, what would it be like to be in Palestine? What would it be like to be in Ukraine? And I think that projected them into wanting to be Asian Americans, to go from being Orientals and being seen as passive objects to actual change makers, to be agents of history. And I think the Third World, beyond connecting to the racism, connecting to the Third World identity, and connecting to their Asian Americanness, I think what was fundamental is that they worked in solidarity with others. And that was really powerful for them. And so I thought all those fundamentals of being part of the Third World Front really drew people together and galvanized them.
Well, let's fast forward to the early stages of Stop AAPI Hate. It launched in 2020 as this online reporting center where people can document incidences of anti-Asian racism. And then, it's safe to say it's become this really influential political movement. And you're also someone who has studied social movements very closely. How much did you and your co-founders draw from the learnings of the previous Asian American activism that took place? Did that kind of context shape the strategies for you and your co-founders?
Yeah, so because I teach Asian American history, we knew history that when pandemics came, Asians would get attacked and we would face a surge of racism. So that's the first lesson of history. The second lesson of Asian American history is that we've always engaged in collective action, that we've always been political activists. So this notion that anti-Asian hate was new, this notion that Asians were the model minority, didn't experience racism. We knew, the organizers and I, we knew that we have a long history. You know, in 1867, 3,000 Chinese railroad workers went on strike at the exact same time across 30 miles of track. They didn't have social media back then, yet they could coordinate in solidarity across dialect, across village, to actually go on strike in solidarity. We knew that in 1892, 100,000 Chinese Americans engaged in civil disobedience. They broke the law purposely because they knew that the Geary Act was unjust. They called it the dog tag law. And that's when the first notion of being Chinese American, which later led to being Asian American, that notion actually developed in the 1890s. We knew that, like in the 1930s during the Sino-Japanese War, Chinese were relegated to working in laundries. They were, again, poor, low-income men, but they actually organized 700 bowl of rice vessels across the nation and raised $22 million in today's money for war relief. So we've built on that legacy of activism. And so when I grew up, I saw the I-Hotel movement. We built on the Justice for Vincent Chin movement in the 1980s. We built on the strategies of South Asians who fought Islamophobia after 9/11. So we used all those strategies. We actually had a worst case scenario meeting, and they told us, you know, what would happen if Asians got more deported because of COVID? What would happen if Asians faced a mass shooting because of COVID? And all those worst case scenarios actually came to pass. So having those activists learning from their lessons was really helpful for Stop AAPI Hate.
So, Greg, we're listening to Russell, one of the co-founders of Stop AAPI Hate, describe sort of the early iterations of this movement. And in 2021, it gains a lot of momentum because of all the news coverage about Asian elders getting attacked. And those stories got a lot of national attention, and many of those incidents were here in the Bay Area. And, you know, I will share, like many Asian American journalists working in a newsroom during that time, we suddenly had this responsibility to either A, advocate for this coverage to be told, to try to make it a point to say we need to be covering this, or a lot of Asian American journalists were just sort of thrust to cover this story because they were maybe one of a couple of Asian Americans in their newsroom. So basically at this time, a lot of newsrooms were just not nimble enough to cover the Asian American community, and I would say that's true even in the Bay Area. We know that media coverage plays a really critical role in how social movements are shaped. Talk us through, what did that early coverage look like?
Yeah, I think it was a pretty big learning curve for a lot of people and a lot of newsrooms. I think that specifically, there have been a lot of studies that have been done about what they found now that we kind of have a bigger lens to look at it and look at that moment and look at the way newsrooms covered these issues. And I talked to a professor, she did a study on how analyzing some news articles, mainly AP articles, but a lot of national news articles about when these rise in hate incidents first started. And there are some really interesting discoveries. She mentioned three in particular. One is that it's really great that we had this backdrop tonight and all this context, because one thing they noticed is that the majority of the stories lacked context, and they lacked information about the history of Asian American racism, which kind of feeds into this idea of the model minority, that this is something new that Asian Americans had to deal with. So it kind of led to that phenomenon that Asian American racism is something new that we have to address right now, and it erases a lot of the history that we've seen tonight. The other thing is that they didn't identify the specific ethnicity of the victim. They would just call them Asian American. 70% of the articles called them Asian American. And so that kind of feeds into this myth about a monolith that I'm sure we'll get into more about, how Asian Americans generally are treated in the media, by politicians, that they all vote the same way, that they think about issues the same way. And so by not breaking it down to this was a Filipino person, or this was a Vietnamese person, this was a Thai person, that's where the stories really, really waned. And then the last thing is that they often didn't identify, either they didn't talk to the victim involved in the attack. They only talked to police or even the suspect, but they didn't talk to the victim. So that doesn't really, it lessens the humanizing effect. And they also didn't, for the majority of the stories, didn't identify the race of the person, that the perpetrator. And so what that led to is some of these, it reinforces a lot of people's biases. And in reality, contrary to the big stories that happened, the data reveals that the majority of the hate incidents, and I'm sure Russell can talk more about this, were by white people, and the majority of the perpetrators, their victims were non-elderly people. So there have been a lot of studies done about that, and I think, as I'm sure we'll talk about tonight, that's just going to continue to feed into some of the tropes that I think Asian American coverage has gone into. And it also revealed, I think, pretty starkly the lack of representation in a lot of Asian American media.
Right. Well, Russell, I want to ask you, because you were getting a ton of media requests when these stories were going viral, to speak on what was happening, to actually just essentially explain Asian American history, and in a soundbite, basically. What were the challenges of that? What was that time like for you?
Well, first of all, it was a really, it was a blur, and it's still a blur for me because things were happening so quickly, and every week politicians would say something horrid about Asians and about the Chinese virus, and then every week another Asian, especially the elderly, were getting attacked. So I felt it too, right? I was getting traumatized too, because it could have been my grandmother, it could have been my mom in the neighborhood where people were getting killed. So that was the first challenge, is just having to experience the racism directly and then having to discuss it time and time again. Again, like Greg said, we had to challenge the model minority myth that Asians weren't experiencing discrimination. This was the first time. We had to talk especially about that these weren't cases of individuals who were prejudiced, but it was happening nationwide, and it was a case of institutionalized racism, that it was being fomented by political rhetoric. And I think that was hard to share, that these weren't, again, single cases. This is national racism against us, national hate. And I got to tell you one last challenge beyond, the changing the narrative. Because I was new to this, I was really bad at talking and speaking to the media. And so I actually had Asian American community leaders call me and say, Russell, you gotta speak better before the press. And they would tell me, you look so shifty-eyed. I go, I can't help it. I'm used to looking down. And they said, you have to emote and enunciate. And I go, oh, okay. He said, this is great. They go,
You're doing great, Russell.
Yeah,
you're doing great.
They said, you have to act like Daniel Day Kim. So that was one of my challenges.
Yeah, but I mean, did you? I mean, you're doing great now. I want to point that out. But I mean, did you feel like you had control over the narrative as the co-founder, this almost like the spokesperson for this movement, this thing that was growing? How much did it feel like in your control?
Early on, we knew we wanted to build a movement, and so it wouldn't be led by a few spokespersons. But we also knew that we needed to send out a consistent message that at least we could change parts of the narrative. So the parts of the narrative that we really sort of tried to, hammer in again, that it isn't an issue of hate crimes. Because if racism was only hate crimes, then the solution is more policing. But if the issue is widespread institutionalized racism, if it's the range of hate incidents, then we could come up with policies that are actually get better to the source of the problem.
Right.
So I think that consistent trying to call it, and they did start calling it hate incidents rather than hate crime. Mm-hmm. They actually did talk about how political rhetoric was the source of the problem. I think in those ways we were helpful in changing how people saw the problem and talked about the problem.
Yeah. Well, Greg, we all know because of this attention, public safety becomes a key concern for many Asian Americans. And it's not just a narrative. It's really easy to talk about these things as narratives. But like many people in this room, there was a palpable fear among ourselves and our loved ones. And that galvanized a lot of Asian Americans to do something different. It gave rise to new advocacy and organizing. What were some of the key ways that Asian Americans really took action and stepped up?
Yeah, it's really interesting. I did, not to toot my own horn, I wrote a profile on Russell that you can read on sfexaminer.com. Terrific profile, yeah.
That's why you're on here.
I know, thank you. It got me on here. And I was really curious about Russell because he's somebody that's studied social movements his entire life, and he knows how they ebb and flow. And so I was really interested in his perspective now that he is on the other end. He is the one initiating a social movement, what his observations were as he watches this very fledgling movement spread its wings, grow branches in different directions. And without a doubt, it created this groundswell of activism, as Russell knows very well. A lot of groups were created. I think there were a lot of great community organizations that took the cue from that and have developed all these great restorative justice initiatives and have been working hard for solidarity. But it's kind of taken on a life of its own. And as I've talked with Russell about, beyond the founders' control. And like you said, Cecilia, public safety has kind of taken center stage. And I know we're going to get to this a little later, but it's been interesting to watch as these community activists have started from a very, I think it should be noted that it's a very genuine place, and it's a very genuine place of fear. No matter what happens afterwards, people are just scared, whether it be for their elders or themselves. And I think everybody can relate to that. But it's what happens after that, and to see where the movement goes, that's really interesting. And I think we're starting to see that materialize in an important election year.
Yeah, I mean, we saw things like people start foot patrols to accompany elders as they buy their groceries in Chinatown. There was like that kind of grassroots effort, but we also saw people become brand new activists. And a lot of these activists, you know, were more moderate, right?
So it's, you know, on its surface, I'll be honest, like, not to undercut all of my reporting, but I basically just started reporting a couple years ago. I'm very new, and I still have a lot to learn. But it's interesting to hear the way people talk about some of these activists and the way they talk about this moderate versus progressive pole across San Francisco politics. But like I said, it started from a very genuine place and a very relatable place for everybody. And it just kind of spread beyond people's control to the point that we're seeing now that some of these moderate forces, and it's very complex. On its surface, it seems like everybody's against, or should be, against racism and against Asian American hate. And when I first joined journalism, I thought that was a very clean perspective and there wasn't much nuance to it. But as you continue to do some reporting, we have this in San Francisco, for the uninitiated, we have this very imprecise but catch-all political ideological scale between progressives and moderates. And moderates are gaining a lot of momentum at City Hall and across San Francisco. And there is a lot of concern on the progressive side about the way that what they see as moderate actors co-opting this Stop AAPI movement. And to be blunt, this is the way the progressives frame it, is it's white actors on that side of the aisle that are using the Stop AAPI Hate movement to increase or to kind of drum up support for pro-policing measures.
Yeah.
And that's really started to, I think, materialize in the last few years. Some of that rhetoric happened during the recall of Chesa Boudin, and it's only continued during this mayoral cycle.
But it's not just about how residents are feeling or how they're acting. It's actually changed the way that politicians are campaigning right now. We can see this in San Francisco with mayoral candidates. Do you feel like Stop AAPI Hate has actually changed the political dynamics in the city? I mean, we see how mayoral candidates are being really specific in trying to reach Asian American voters around public safety issues. I mean, is that sort of a safe thing to say that it's changed the dynamics?
It's interesting because I've talked to a lot of different Asian American politicians recently about this, and it's pretty mixed response in terms of how they view how the rise in hate incidents and the Stop AAPI Hate movement has changed politics in San Francisco and changed the way Asian Americans are thought of. But on the whole, I think it's evident that it has increased the amount of rhetoric where politicians speak about public safety. And I think Phil Ting made this point to me the other day when I was talking to him, our assembly member in San Francisco, who is being termed out at the end of the year after almost a dozen years in office. And he said that he didn't think that a lot of these young activists that sprouted up because of the Stop AAPI Hate movement have a lot of staying power. That's actually a common thought on the progressive side. But to be clear, they're not blaming the moderates. Well, actually, they are blaming the moderates a little bit because of the moderates tend to be really well funded by tech groups. We're seeing that with organizations like Together SF and Grow SF. But they're also seeing this, that they're very self-critical, and a lot of them say we didn't organize very well, or the moderates organized better. And a lot of these young activists, they thought, some of them think that they could have gone to either moderate or progressive, because if you there's actually a great Mission Local article that just came out about one of these organizations that sprouted up out of some really real fears. This organization called Dear Community, and these are the type of activists we're talking about that now somebody in the Dear Community space, her name's J2, she's now running Mark Farrell's campaign, and he's generally viewed as one of, if not the most moderate candidate on the mayoral side. So the progressives are very self-critical, but they thought that potentially somebody like J2 or one of these young activists, they could have organized better and brought them in and made them a progressive politician instead of what's happened now.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting Russell, to listen to what Greg is describing here, sort of the political atmosphere in San Francisco that's been influenced by the movement that you co-founded. Now, you stepped away from Stop AAPI Hate about a year ago, and you returned to teaching full-time. So you've had some time to reflect on what's happened. And I want to quote this line from the Stop AAPI Hate website, which describes the organization's approach. It reads, quote, "At Stop AAPI Hate, our work is grounded in the belief that we must confront racism at its root with comprehensive, non-carceral solutions to effectively prevent and respond to anti-AAPI hate." That sounds a little bit different than some of the policies that have seemingly become associated with Stop AAPI Hate. Things like more policing, more funding for police departments, heavier prosecutions. And critics have said that it may be pulling away from some of the efforts from the Black Lives Matter movement. What do you make of this? That, this dichotomy between what Stop AAPI Hate says it wants to do and how it's being perceived?
Yeah, it's really grievous to me. I think we have to really distinguish between the Stop AAPI Hate Coalition and then the movement that followed and sort of diversified. And I guess I want to make a couple of distinctions. That we were experiencing anti-Asian hate in the form of hate incidents, and some were crimes. And then a lot of people in San Francisco are victims of crime in general. But any crime against Asian was then termed and conflated as anti-Asian hate crime. And that is part of the problem, is that the racism and the neighborhood violence were two separate phenomena that have different sources and need to be dealt with at their source. So for we at Stop AAPI Hate, we wanted, again, to get at the root causes of the racism, which we thought was the political rhetoric and the institutionalized racism. If you want to get at neighborhood safety, then you have to deal with community issues that not only Asians face, but blacks face more black-on-black crime, right? Others in those low-income neighborhoods face a lot of violent crime because those are the neighborhoods where you experience that type of crime. But again, when it gets conflated, then political opportunists use it, and they call that anti-Asian hate, and they use identity politics to rally and mobilize the mass. White funders also, and this is, the trend is they would try to divide and conquer, right? And so they would say, Asians are facing discrimination, and so they need to get more attention, they need more policing. And I think that's part of the problem, is that, again, we're sort of being used as a wedge group to support certain political orientations. So for me, it's not an either-or issue. Do we deal with racism in a community-oriented way, or do we deal with crime with more policing? We need a range of solutions that actually get at the root of the problem that's more preventative.
But Russell, you told me something when I did the profile on you, again, sfexaminer.com, and
I love it.
One thing you said was that there may be a few bad actors, or more than a few, that use the movement for their own political gain. But you also did make clear to me that that also means that the movement is healthy, that it's growing, and that when it spreads to different parts beyond your control, that happens throughout every social movement we've seen throughout history.
Yeah, and that's, I think, like you said, a lot of the activists, especially the Asian American activists, were really genuine in their desire to improve our community conditions. And so I don't begrudge them. I think it is healthy that we have we're a diverse community, so why don't we have a diverse range of political attitudes? We should have a range of leaders that we want to pick from rather than a few token leaders, right? Yeah. So it makes sense that we both have that range of political philosophies, but we shouldn't have this being used as a foil by certain developers or certain.
Well, that's one of the things that concerns me, right? Because let's be frank and candid, anti-Blackness is something and a long-standing issue in the Asian American community. Are you worried about that deepening in this moment, because of this atmosphere right now and the way that Stop AAPI Hate has been used and leveraged?
Yeah, I am really concerned, and I think that's why we really pressed on the need for solidarity. I think with the affirmative action decisions being handed down, I really do feel like Asian Americans are being anti-Black. Actually, this is what I teach in my classes. Asians come as immigrants, they want the American dream, but if you pursue the American dream, that's pretty much pursuing whiteness, because white normativity is how you gain power, white normativity is how you gain privilege, white normativity is how you gain meritocratic treatment. So we don't want to be white, we just want the privileges that whites have. But in that pursuit of the American dream and in seeking then whiteness, we become anti-Black. And this is, I think, something that the Asian American community really does need to wrestle with as we think about our position in the US, as we think about running for office, as we think about wanting to lead a city. Who are we leading and where do we want to go?
Yeah. I love that we're talking to you now, because you stepped away a little bit and had some time to reflect. But I wonder for you, especially as someone who's been teaching Asian American studies for so long, this has been an incredible educational opportunity for everyone. What has that felt like for you to suddenly see Asian American studies get a platform in this way? And the need is so clear now.
I think we in Asian American Studies, and it's not just me, but a lot of faculty, a lot of people in Asian American Studies, a lot of my students actually helped start Stop AAPI Hate. We were doing exactly what we were founded to do. That ethnic studies led by Pat Salaver and others from PACE, from the Third World Liberation Front, their vision of education wasn't that it was for individual mobility. It wasn't to get people out of Chinatown into the suburbs, but it was actually to affect community change. So it wasn't this neoliberal approach, it's about individualism, it's about community change. And so for us to be engaged with Stop AAPI Hate, for us to analyze and provide the data to document the issue, I think that's exactly what Asian American Studies should have been, or should be doing. And it's really gratifying to see that now 7 states have passed ethnic studies or Asian American studies at the K through 12 level. So that's the next movement, to push Asian American studies beyond the college level, but to get it down to the K through 12 level.
Yeah. We just have a couple of minutes left before we give the audience an opportunity to ask some questions, but I want to ask both of you, where do you want to see this going now? You know, as a journalist, you're helping explain this in real time, explain what's going on in San Francisco at City Hall, but where do you see this going from now? I mean, maybe things will change after November.
Yeah, well, I think it is going to be really interesting to see what happens in November. I think post Stop AAPI Hate, to use the catch-all term, not to use the movement as the term, we haven't seen an election that's going to have this big of turnout. And it's really going to be interesting to see how Asian Americans vote in every different ethnic group. What I want to see out of coverage, I want to see more people that look like me be in newsrooms.
Yes.
And I also want to see, and I think I'm guilty of this too, but because Chinese Americans have such a dominant presence in San Francisco, I do want to see Asian Americans spoken about beyond just using the term Asian American. And because Japanese Americans vote differently than Chinese Americans, Korean Americans vote differently than Vietnamese Americans. Within Japanese American community, we have different classes who all vote differently. And I also think that Asian American, the group as a whole, a lot of these trends aren't unique to Asian Americans. Some of them are, but they also mirror a lot of what's happening at the wide-scale city level. So I think, and that's in a lot of my conversations, what I want to see, that a lot of politicians want to see is have more diversity of coverage. And I do want to say real quick that Jane Kim said something to me the other day about, or actually a progressive activist told me this today about how she just wants to see more nuance when it comes to coverage. And that's why I think a lot of the moderate actors have been able to have such a loud voice, is because it's a really clean way to say more policing, less hate crimes.
Yeah.
Whereas it's harder to be more nuanced and it's harder to spread that message.
Yeah. Well, let's give the audience an opportunity to ask you both some questions. Is there someone who has a question for Russell or Greg? You answered everything. You said it all. No, there's one.
Hi, I'm Alan Montesilio. I'm the editor of The Bay on KQED. Subscribe now. Russell, I'm curious, and Greg, for you too. How do you, or I guess mostly for Russell, how do you experience the differences of opinion among Asian Americans regarding that come out of Stop AAPI Hate? Some might say, oh, we need more police. Some might say we don't need more police. We've talked about it in kind of a big picture sense, but how do you experience that? How do you handle that as someone who's obviously a big part of this movement? In terms of how do I handle the range of opinions about how to address Stop AAPI Hate? Yeah. In your own life, or either in your own life or in your classroom or wherever. Yeah, it's one thing I took away from dealing with Stop AAPI Hate is that Asians ourselves, as we become victims of violence, we could perpetuate that violence. We could become anti-white, we could become anti-black, and perpetuate racism against others. And so I really sort of developed and thought a lot about nonviolence. And so for me, when I hear people with different opinions about different political strategies, I don't want to perpetuate a cycle of violence or a cancel culture, but I want to develop a sense of empathy and understanding so that we could have real solidarity, basically. And so for me, it's a challenge, it's difficult, but I want to learn from a diversity of ideas, understand where people are coming from, and try to work together towards some common solutions. And that seems like a pipe dream in America's polarized society. But I think that's a lesson about ending cycles of violence, ending the cycle of racism. We can't be people hurting people. We can't be canceled people canceling others.
Hi, my name is Rosalind Romero. I'm a public safety reporter for the Oakland side. I guess my question is for both of you, Greg and Dr. Jeung, but I feel like a lot of the journalism industry, or a lot of, I would say, because I used to be a TV producer, and we would have to deal with very strict deadlines and timelines for stories, and those stories would be 30 seconds, 90 seconds. It's really difficult to package that sort of nuance into something so short. I'm wondering if either of you have any advice for journalists on how to convey that nuance, if it's even possible, for people, or for journalists who are on such tight deadlines and who have to deliver. There's this emphasis on clicks and short stories and short form content to get more engagement. So I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on that.
Well, I deal with some of those same issues. My editor's in the audience today, and he'll tell you that I always agree to whatever word count he sets, and I always come in way under that word count, and I always follow the rules. It's tough because we, in the industry, to use an inside baseball term, we call it feeding the beast, of getting as many stories out as possible to get our web traffic numbers up, and we're running a business. But on the other hand, you have to balance that with a lot of really important investigative reporting. And the way I try to do it is I just try to trust that if I think some investigative piece and something that really reveals an important side of an issue is worth reporting on, then they're also going to be interested. The readers are also going to be interested in that topic. And you just have to trust yourself that if this is something you're really curious about and that you want to explore, then the reader will also follow that same line of thought.
Russell, do you have thoughts on that?
Yeah, I really noticed that broadcast TV news journalists were a lot more aggressive, and they just wanted that 5-second soundbite. And I think they really contributed, whoever they are, to the Black on Asian narrative, because they would often highlight violent crime, because that's what gets news audiences. And that's what I thought was really tragic, is that certain types of hate crimes get depicted, you see the visuals, and that becomes really problematic. And so for me, I wish they would provide, again, like more context, at least show the range of racism experienced by Asians, who perpetrators are across the nation. And just that's why we thought our data was really significant, is we could provide that backdrop and provide context. And again, it wasn't this, racial issue. What is a racial issue, not a Black on Asian issue.
Yeah. That's all the time we have. Everyone, please give it up for Greg and Russell. Thank you both so much. Thank you very much. I appreciate it. I know, I'm sorry. There was someone who wanted to ask a question. Maybe you can catch them later. So as we just heard in that conversation, the momentum and attention around Stop AAPI Hate has ignited a new wave of advocacy and re-energized people who have been doing the work long before there was all this attention. So we want to have a conversation now with some of those folks. Joining me now are Asian American community leaders who are on the ground and organizing in their respective communities. We'll hear about their work, what this moment has meant to them, and where they see us going next. One of our panelists is Gia Vang. Gia is the co-founder of the Very Asian Foundation, a national nonprofit that seeks to shed light on AA-NHPI experiences through advocacy and education. She's also an Emmy Award-winning television journalist for a Bay Area affiliate and has more than 15 years of experience in markets across the country. She's also the daughter of Hmong refugees from Laos. Everyone, please welcome Gia. Thanks for being here. Next, we have Janie Chen. Janie is a second-generation Chinese-American born and raised in East Oakland. She currently works at Asian Health Services as an advocacy program manager in the working-class Asian immigrant and refugee neighborhood, where her childhood memories and passion for community advocacy began. Prior to her role at Asian Health Services, she worked as a bookseller and events coordinator at the beloved East Wind Books. Shout out to Harvey again. She is the co-editor of the anthology titled Power of the People Won't Stop, Legacy of the Third World Liberation Front at UC Berkeley. Everyone, please welcome Janie. And we also have Pixie Castillo. She is the national chairperson of Gabriela USA, a progressive, grassroots, anti-imperialist national organization that supports groups of Filipino women, non-Filipino women, and children in various areas of the world. Pixie has been organizing with the National Democratic Movement of the Philippines since she was a student at SF State. Actually, Russell was her professor. And she's been with Gabriela USA since 2016. Everyone, please welcome Pixie. So I'm really excited to have this conversation because you all are just amazing leaders in your respective communities, and we have a lot to learn from each of you. But Jay, I'd love to start with you. You're a reporter and a news anchor with NBC Bay Area, but I want to discuss your other work because in 2022, you and another journalist, Michelle Lee, co-founded the Very Asian Foundation, which does a variety of work empowering Asian Americans. And we've been talking a lot about this political momentum around the community in recent years. What were you feeling compelled to do outside of your profession? We've talked a lot about what journalists were able to do during this time. What else did you want to do?
Well, thanks for having me, Cecilia, and good to see everyone. I think, so you talked about us starting in 2022, which was probably about 2 years, 3 years that we started measuring AA and HPI hate, right? It was, if you're Asian, you knew that it was happening before, but we started measuring it with groups like Russell's Stop AAPI Hate. And so I think when this happened, it happened because of a racist voicemail that my friend and co-founder Michelle Lee got in St. Louis. Someone called her very Asian, very annoying. She needed to keep her Korean to herself. And I think there was so much that Russell had already laid out that happened during those years. We're talking about the pandemic. We're talking about things like the Kung flu. We're talking about Atlanta spa shootings and things personally that happened to me, including my dad being the victim of a racist tirade from a woman in Minnesota. And so all of these things had happened, and then that happened to Michelle, and I just felt, wow, there is such a large disconnect with people understanding who we are. Mm-hmm. And I feel like there's like, and Rosalind, who's here, talked about it, but there is limits to what we can do in professionally. And so I think for me, it was, okay, what else can we do to kind of bridge this really wide divide of who we are as people and bring our full selves to the table. So Michelle and I started the Very Asian Foundation, and one of Michelle's quotes that she uses is, you know, we want to make sure that when we walk into a room that we can bring our full humanity. Mm-hmm. And I think it really resonated with so many people because we had been talking about anti-Asian hate for so long. Mm-hmm. And we got so many messages from across the country and the world really saying, oh, thank God, like finally. And I think that was kind of a sigh because we were for so many years seen as just victims. And we wanted to go beyond that because Michelle is a mother. She's a Korean adoptee. I am the daughter of refugees. I'm also a partner. I'm also a dog parent, right? We have all of these different identities in which we move in the world. And I think that people who are Asian were really, really yearning to see something like that.
Yeah. It's also interesting though, Gia, because, you know, as journalists, we are told don't be an advocate. So how do you sort of balance that, you know, with your profession and also speaking for the community in this way?
Yeah, you know, that's a tricky one. I think when I first got into the industry 15 plus years ago, I was told to, okay, you go in, you're not biased, you don't have any opinions. And I thought to myself, okay, and I kind of did that for so many years. And then I got to this point where I was just thinking, wait a minute, I'm in these newsrooms and I don't have a say on how a community that I've been a part of for my entire life is covered. Mm-hmm. And so I think that also happened during Atlanta too. As we know, there were law enforcement had said, you know, this guy who went to go shoot these women in these spas, women and men, mostly women, was just having a bad day. And I think as an Asian woman, you had experiences throughout your entire life that really could be more nuanced, as we talked about, to tell the full, complete story of what was happening. And so I think I'm just really urging newsrooms today to allow people to come in fully as themselves so they can tell these stories and not just do the typical stories that we've seen throughout the years and years of news. So I think it's tricky, obviously, but I also think if we're coming in with a different background and not actually doing the thing that we are set out to do, which is truth-telling, then what are we actually doing?
Right, right. Well, Pixie, I want to turn to you. And I was saying that tonight's program has a connection for you because Russell was your Asian American Studies professor, so a bit of a full circle moment right now. And you have said that your college education and experiences made you really think deeply about the Filipino immigrant experience. And it's led you to your work now with Gabriela USA, which centers around a grassroots anti-imperialist approach to organizing. So it's interesting because so much was happening locally here in the Bay Area, all these conversations. How did that inform your transnational work?
Thank you. Yeah, definitely. I think being able to come from San Francisco State University and learning from the Third World Liberation Front and having a background in student organizing, definitely the emphasis for me was like on the collective action and how that really leads to transformative change. And so in our in the time during the pandemic, I think definitely trying to see in what ways can we still gather, in what ways can we still bring people together, whether that was online, which a lot of it was, trying to transform what was like everyday in person, the collective life together, now translating that to online. Meanwhile, there was also so much happening, especially for our Filipino or Asian American communities with, different like attacks and violence. And I think during this time, we also saw, the increase in these different incidences, right, on violent attacks on our community members. And so even throughout that time, I think for us in Gabriela, we were also working with like the different cases happening. One that's, I think, really shows the development of collective action and even going beyond just an individual incident. Was a case and a campaign actually from Southern California called Justice for the Roques, where the Roque family, I think maybe some folks know about it, the Roque family were attacked in a McDonald's parking lot. There was an aggressive person who, physically attacked the family. And so throughout this time, like the family actually has developed their case to actually develop more community support and community empowerment, really going beyond just like an incident of a crime on one family. Now talking about like, what is this stemming from? Where are these like root problems coming from, and how does this also exacerbate the already ongoing trauma coming from family separation, coming from forced migration, and so it's transformed a lot, and the family has actually become leaders in their own right, and so I think just the examples of that, and there's like also a documentary film being made called Be Not Afraid. And we really, want to be able to tell these stories of how collective action can really change communities, can really build community support and, transform these incidences that might seem like like people will be like, oh, such a shame. Oh, I'm sorry that happened, but actually making them more empowering all of the folks that, might just be called folks who have, had something happen to them.
Yeah.
And so,
it's, I mean, it sounds like you were able to connect the dots more between your work and what was happening. And that leads me to my question for you, Jamie, because in our last panel, we talked a lot about public safety and how it became this key concern. And that was really a big concern in Oakland, Chinatown, where you work. It's where Asian Health Services is. And then Asian Health Services, along with other organizations in Oakland, Chinatown, took this unique approach around public safety concerns. You were part of a program that aimed to help elders in Oakland, Chinatown expand and understand a different perspective of community safety. Tell me more about that.
Yeah, thanks for the question. So, Asian Health Services is a community health center that's located in Oakland, Chinatown, and we serve around 50,000 patients in 14 different Asian languages. And most of our patients are immigrants and refugees and monolingual or limited English-speaking folks who receive Medi-Cal. And so sort of how HS came into this work around public safety was that in 2021, with the onset of the pandemic, we saw that there was an increase in attacks that were happening to the Asian American community, but also to our staff and to our patients. And we're hearing stories from our doctors. Our doctors are from the community themselves. They're first generation, they're immigrants, refugees themselves. So they've built these trusted relationships with our patients. And our patients, instead of turning to law enforcement, were telling our doctors and our medical staff about what was happening to them. So we took all that was happening with our patients, all the stories, all that what was happening on the ground, and created the Community Healing Unit, which provides holistic victims services and case management. And yeah, I think from that, we were able to see that there were a lot of violences, a lot of different types of violences that were happening. And we also started to see that, public safety is a part of community health, which means that there's context to these attacks. It's not just one-off individual random violences that happen that are perpetuated by a bunch of bad individuals, but that it's actually a structural issue related to breakdown in our social welfare networks, breakdown in our education, lack of resources, and our communities being historically disinvested in. Sorry, I have my talking points.
It's all good.
So yeah, with this public health approach too, Asian Health Services, like Cecilia mentioned, saw the need to partner with other communities that were being affected. So one of the projects that came out of it was the Community Safety Series. It's a 5-part series that we collaborated with the Asian Pacific Environmental Network, APEN, and we did it in support of with the Oakland Chinatown Coalition. And the series essentially took 12 working class Chinese seniors from Chinatown on different field trips to learn about what other organizations and what other communities were doing on the ground around public safety. And we intentionally took on this experiential learning model because we wanted to create experiences that would build up their political education and their awareness.
And I got to witness this too. It was beautiful. It's these 12 Chinese elders wearing headsets for translation, and they would visit West Oakland, the Black Panther Museum. Mm-hmm. They visited San Quentin. I mean, these were really intentional sites to bring folks to understand why crime happens or what are sort of some of the challenges facing other communities. Tell me more about that specific strategy because it's such a unique curriculum.
Yeah, I think usually for me, I was an ethnic studies student, so a lot of the history that I've learned is based on, lectures and workshops and theories and policies. We knew that wouldn't resonate with regular working class folks. knowing that there are different levels of understanding and commitment with each other. So we instead wanted to create experiences and, you know, bring people into West Oakland and bring people into St. Quentin so they can create those more human connections and begin to see people in a more human way. And so, like, rather than using lectures and workshops, we focused on like meeting, visiting, breaking bread with other communities that was more effective in fostering empathy and connection.
Yeah, and what was their response? These Chinatown elders visiting a prison, visiting a Black Panther museum, maybe learning that history for the first time. What did they think?
Yeah, one story that I wanted to share. So one of the participants, she herself was a victim of a robbery that was really traumatizing. And afterwards, when she visited St. Quentin and she saw the conditions of incarceration and she saw her own people behind bars, at the end of the series, she said that she was able to let go, which is really profound and very powerful. It was a very powerful moment of healing because once, you know, you see incarceration, you kind of get pulled away from the idea that that's the only solution to safety. So the seniors, a lot of it at the end of this series, were able to kind of shift the conversation around safety from something that's very hyper-focused on like stronger law enforcement and surveillance to something that is more like, oh, we need to like look at our youth and what's happening there. How can we support them at an earlier age, and how can we intervene and prevent, and how do we provide more mental health resources? How do we work together with West Oakland? Something that is more community-based and calls for actions between local government and community.
Yeah. I mean, it was a beautiful thing to witness. And Gia, I want to ask you because, you know, as we're talking about Oakland Chinatown, I mean, and Greg mentioned this in the earlier panel that when we talk about Asian Americans in the Bay Area, oftentimes it is about the Chinese community. And, you know, to be frank, sometimes solidarity between the groups under the AAPI umbrella is pretty tough. And there's a lot of groups that feel unseen or buried under coverage of the Chinese community. So for you, as a Hmong American, how has that sort of shaped your advocacy as you're also speaking on, you know, doing stories about this very broad, large, but pretty fragmented population?
Yeah, I think you're right. Solidarity is hard. I think we also have to be frank about how we define solidarity too. So I think that there's kind of a point there that we as a large group have to make a point to do. I think that, you know, growing up Hmong American was very hyper focused on being Hmong. And so for me, it wasn't like, oh, I'm Asian American, as we learned from Russell. You know, the history of that term wasn't until the 1960s.
1968.
Yeah, and so I think that for me growing up, that term wasn't really there. It was more we were Hmong, and my parents were hyper focused on us being Hmong. And I think in the Hmong community, there was a lot of mutual aid that was being done. Like, we came here as refugees, and if a family needed a car, the Vang clan would pull their money together and they would get this family a car, or they would fix this car up for this family. And so we relied on each other in that way. And so I was hyper focused on that. And then you get thrust into this Asian American umbrella when things like anti-Asian hate start happening, and people just look at you and they're like, oh, what do you think? And you're like, oh, well, and you kind of are just thrust into that position. And so I think that while I see myself as Hmong, I also see myself as Asian American, and I think that the work that I do today, both professionally and in my advocacy work, it both toggles the line of, you know, I want to make sure that groups that I grew up with, like the Iumian or my Filipinos or, you know, my Korean adoptees, like Michelle's Korean adoptee. And so I want to make sure that those groups have a voice because they really don't feel seen. And I think when I'm a part of a group like the Very Asian Foundation, you know, we just gave our grantees $1,000 each, 6 of them. And there are 2 that are Hmong American. And I don't know if they would apply for this if I wasn't a part of the foundation, right? And so even representation in that way in these foundations and these organizations are super important. And then in storytelling, when it comes to professional work, you know, you have to make sure that those groups, like I know that my friend Sheehan is here from Little Saigon, and that, you know, those stories in Little Saigon and Oakland matter too, and making sure that you reach across aisles to bring out that solidarity. But one thing I do want to say about solidarity, in which I feel and my definition of it, I guess, would be, you know, when we had an event, it was a Very Asian Foundation event in Minnesota, and it was great, and it went off without a hitch, and it was wonderful. And then we had a post party, and people came, and it was like all groups of folks. And the moment I felt solidarity was after that event, where we were all sitting around a table, and someone had DoorDash something, and we were all eating together. And that was solidarity to me. Is like, in your day-to-day actions, what can you do also to have solidarity with someone who doesn't look like you, doesn't have the same experience as you? And I would say, like, you know, even with our friends here from Little Saigon, I feel solidarity in that way, where I just show up and I'm like, oh, I'm going to stop by, I'm going to do this, or we're texting each other about something. You know, I feel solidarity in that way. And I think the day-to-day really matters when it comes to solidarity amongst all of these groups that we have now.
Yeah. I want to pose this next question to both Pixie and Jamie, because the work that you do, we're talking about the fragmentation of the AAPI community, but it's also intergenerational, right? And you have to speak across generations, and that's really, really tough. How do you do that? How do you kind of connect and build bridges between different generations where folks may have different ideologies, right? People are not going to be on the same page. How does that look like in your day-to-day work?
I think for us, especially in Gabriela USA, with different chapters around the country, we also try to have trying to have more diverse membership in age. But I think definitely making sure that we're also, developing our collective life together. That also includes, getting on the same page via like political education. And that can also be through like kwentuhan, which in Tagalog just means like conversation. And really trying to understand where everyone is coming from, and really understanding what is another person's point of view. That's a really big part of our organizing work, and really talking to people, and really being able to communicate. I think, making sure that we're, we call it speaking the same language. Even if we're speaking like different dialects of Filipino, or I'm speaking Tagalog and somebody's speaking English, still making sure that we're on the same page, especially when it comes to our foundational work, or our ideas of like solidarity, and understanding like what are our unities and what are our collective goals. And so I think once we can get on the same page, especially in developing like our campaigns work, so like addressing state neglect and economic plunder, whether that's also addressing ongoing militarization in the Philippines through our US Out campaigns, just making sure that folks are also united. I think that's a big part. And it's not always easy, especially when there are many different ideas and experiences that span generations. But I think when we're able to talk with each other and really learn lessons, and get on the same page about what was something that was positive that came out of, for example, like one of our campaigns from 2020, are there lessons we can learn from doing many like online activities? How can we actually translate that to now making those in-person connections? And so, giving this space to that, and taking the time to unite so that we can actually move forward in collective action together.
And what about for you, Janie? Because that's a challenge, right? Especially in Oakland, Chinatown, because it's so multi-generational.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think there could be a common perception of, Chinese seniors as, maybe more conservative or set in their ways. There's definitely that cultural and linguistic aspect. There are language barriers that, prevent me from communicating with my grandpa and having deeper conversations. But with the series, we were able to do everything in language and with simultaneous interpretation. And I think our model of organizing, with it being very intentionally experiential, kind of creating the space and the container for seniors to learn, to understand, and also to ask questions. It's like one thing that really shocked us about the series was how curious the seniors were. They were asking more, there's one senior who met an incarcerated folk who was from the same province in China that she was in, and from that point of connection, she just had so many questions. So I think it's just allowing space for these learning experiences, being really open, and just allowing our seniors to lead with curiosity without any judgment.
Yeah. Before we turn to audience questions, I'll do a quick lightning round, and maybe this is hard for a lightning round, but is there an issue that you think has been overlooked in the API community that you would now like to see more coverage or attention on, because there is this awareness and momentum built? Gia, maybe start with you.
I think Russell touched on it too, but I do want to say that I think since this Stop AAPI Hate movement has happened, mental health has been kind of at the forefront. And I think mental health of our youth is really important. I think for the Very Asian Foundation, we started our May Book Project, which is a program that we have, one of our most popular programs where we put diverse books into school libraries. We did it at Cleveland, in Oakland. We did it at John Yehil Chin in Chinatown here, and then also in San Mateo at College Park. And it started because there was students who were in St. Louis who said, we don't feel seen. We've gone to our school district many times. They are not putting books in our libraries where it reflects our stories or who we are, and some of them were talking about self-harming. And so for us, I think that's really a critical piece as we move forward, is to really engage with the youth about their mental health and make sure that we're taking care of them and ourselves.
Right.
Yeah, I think one thing that I've learned from the seniors, again, it's sort of the importance of political education and multi-racial collaboration. So I think about one of the seniors from our West Oakland trip, after learning about the Black Panther Party, they made a statement saying that, Chinatown and West Oakland should continue to work together to build the environment that we want to see. And that was really powerful because just 30 minutes ago, they hadn't even stepped foot in West Oakland. So just to see that, they were able to learn about the history of a historically redlined neighborhood, connect the dots and find the areas of similarities, and also just to go outside of their bubble of Chinatown and kind of be able to situate themselves within a larger context and a larger community. So those connections were really valuable, building across communities and also having that political history in mind.
I think the addressing the isolation, especially for migrant Filipino workers, who many are continuously exploited in their day-to-day jobs, working multiple jobs. So I think the understanding and space given to actually be able to do the political education and address the mental health. I think we should really look at how our working class migrant community are really being treated in their day-to-day work, how many jobs they have to take just to survive. And so I think there are many organizations addressing the issue, but I think still coming back, especially to our AAPI migrant families and working class folks.
Great, thank you. Are there questions for our panelists from the audience?
So my name is Joanne Jeung, and shout out to Asian Health Services, where I used to work as a pediatrician for close to a decade before moving on. So it sounds like amazing work that you're doing in helping to, what struck me was to try and build understanding and empathy to help maybe replace a lot of the fear that they naturally had, right? And it struck me as such a powerful approach. And so it made me think a lot about some of the divides I see in the Asian American community. I think some of the ones are obvious. It's like, oh yeah, different races, different countries of origin, different languages, and we often think that way. But the divide I found myself thinking much more about was between generation and class. Okay, so first generation, not speaking English quite as well, often in their ethnic enclaves just because of language barriers and less opportunity maybe to learn about the history of this country, probably very little understanding of the history of the civil rights movement and race and racism in this country, right? And then you have the second generation, which is, which has more opportunity, just by virtue of language and education here, to learn that history. And I know it was really powerful for me to come to an understanding that my rights now, I directly owe to the civil rights movement, right? Like all these rights and privileges that I enjoy now is directly the result of the work of activists in the civil rights movement. And that really helped me to understand the common cause that I have with other peoples of color within this country. But that's not a history that my parents ever heard, right? Or ever knew or ever understood, which is partly commentary. This sounds like an amazing way of helping to fill in some of the gaps for the immigrant generation. So the question maybe for all the panelists is to think about how can we build a greater sense of security and actual greater physical security by building stronger interracial dialogue in community? And what are the opportunities to do that?
So the question is, how do we build a stronger sense of interracial community and connection? Yeah. I feel like, Janie, the program you're describing is such a beautiful example. And I will say, when I was watching it in action, I was like, well, this is the harder work, right? I think this is the long, slow, individual, direct approach, which may be some of the challenges of building those kind of connections, that it takes that sort of intentionality. But do you all sort of take that sort of intentional, slower, direct approach, as opposed to this big sort of movements that we've been witnessing over the past recent years?
Yeah, that's a good question. That's a big question. I think, yes, to Cecilia's point about how these connections are gradually made, and it's really through exposure and seeing your neighbor that people are able to sort of slowly peel back the layers of traditional thinking that they grew up with. I can think of examples of Asian Health Services working with Baywell Health, formerly known as West Oakland Health Center. That in itself is a really strong, beautiful example of Black and Asian solidarity, of two communities coming together. And then now, AHS in West Oakland, having, with everything that was happening with attacks on Asians, asking, turning to our patients in our community and asking those hard questions around what is happening, what are the stereotypes, and what are the experiences that are happening, and then finding out what are the needs that both communities need. It's lack of food access or lack of health care, and then creating spaces where two communities can kind of coexist. Just because geographically we may be separated, but we face similar challenges. So creating joint food distributions where both communities are able to come in and just, be together. Even though they may not speak the same language, they're able to see that that's their neighbor. So I would say, I mean, more opportunities for experiences where people can just connect and meet and break bread.
Yeah. Before we end, do either of you want to chime in at all? Or?
Yeah, I think for us, definitely also giving time and space to learn from each other. There's so many like lessons we can learn from different movements throughout history and then current. And so I think we've been lucky in Gabriela USA working with Bayan USA, also another Filipino alliance organization, but having also our international solidarity work really also, I think, especially at a time right now when we're seeing like genocide happening, the more reason why we have to build solidarity, the more reason why we have to reach out to different communities and organizations who we might not have worked with before, to build these different unities and ways that we can collaborate and build that collective power. I think really taking inspiration from all of the ways we've heard earlier, especially about the TWLF and the movements that have come before, and how do we really take that inspiration and move it forward.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, I'm piggybacking off of everyone because I think those are really important ways in which to put people who might not be in the same place together. I know there's a youth group that is Asian and Black, and they travel to all these different historical sites, and they, at the end of it, they're best friends. And a lot of them will say, you know, I didn't know I could be friends with a Black person, or I didn't know I could be friends with an Asian person, but they become best friends. So those experiences are so pivotal for creating the cross-racial solidarity that we talk about. I also just want to say something really simple is just showing up. Like, you just have to show up to their events, and sometimes they're going to be like, who are you? But then if you keep showing up, that's such an important way to just get people to start trusting you too, and to start learning about you and who you are and why you're interested. It's like, it's just because I want to be there for you when you guys are celebrating too. And so I think showing up is so important.
Yeah. Well, everyone, please give it up for our panelists, Gia, Jamie, and Pixie. Thank you so much. Thank you. So that concludes our evening. Thank you everyone so much for being here. And I gotta say, it is really hard to do any sort of Asian American program because it's tricky. It's impossible to cover every single perspective or group in this really large, complicated, diverse population. But my hope tonight is that maybe you've learned something new or you appreciated a fresh perspective that you didn't hear before. Everyone, please give also another round of applause to all our performers and speakers tonight: Emily Kwong, Nicole Salaver, Russell Jeung, Greg Wong, Gia Vang, Janie Chen, and Pixie Castillo. I also just want to shout out our community partners who helped amplify our event: PACE at SF State, the San Francisco Bay Area chapter of the Asian American Journalists Association, the API Council, Chinese Cultural Center, Chinese Progressive Association, Asian Health Services, Chinatown Community Development Center, and Edge on the Square. Big thank you to the KQD Live events team, including Ryan Davis and Sarah Rose Leonard, and the amazing tech team up there. And also a little plug for KQD, because this has been the evening of plugs. There are fun things happening here next weekend. Join us for KQD Fest on Saturday, October 19th from 11 a.m. to 6 p.m. for a free all-ages block party and open house. There'll be programs on stage. You can tour the building. There's fireside chats, music, food trucks. Just come and enjoy. Don't miss it. Be well, everyone, and please get home safe.